Okay, good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you so much for having me in this conference. This is not my first time in Kazakhstan or Astana, so it's always a pleasure to come back here. How are you doing? You're doing fine? Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, if I can have my slides over there, it's easier to... Okay, good. So we already heard something about the situation in education globally. There was a line from the World Bank's recent report that the education is in crisis all over the world, and today or yesterday the UN released the Global Education Monitoring Report. So we have a lot of understanding about what's going on. What I'm going to speak to you in next 28 minutes is a little outlook as I see the education evolving globally, and I'm going to leave you with some insights or personal recommendations regarding values, well-being that is becoming increasingly important thing, and innovation for the future. If you want to take a look at these slides, this presentation, the easiest thing is to join me in social media, in Twitter, or go to my website. I'll put this presentation there for you right after this conference. So let me start by taking you back in time. Let's assume for a moment that we are here in Kazakhstan or Astana in 2001 in a conference. Just think for a moment that this is not 2017, but we are 16 years back in time. And this is an education conference. And somebody stands here making a keynote, asking you a question that where would you look at, where would you go if you were interested in finding good ideas how to build a successful system of education. I'm not talking about the school, because building a successful school is a very different thing than building the entire system. So the question here 16 years ago would be that where would you look at, where would you travel, or who would you invite into a conference like this if your interest would be in making successful system of education. Okay? I don't know exactly what you have in mind, but I know that there are many people here who would say that certainly we would go to places like United States of America, or New Zealand, or Japan, or England. Some people would go to Germany, or Switzerland, or Sweden, or Norway. But I can assure you with one thing, that there would be very few people in this room 16 years ago, if any, who would say that I would go to Finland. That's where I come from. Because many people say that Finland didn't really exist 16 years ago. Very few people knew anything at all about Finland, except maybe our ice hockey and Nokia phones and something like that. But education was not in the agenda. So my point here is that something has happened because so many people are now looking at quite different places for inspiration for education. Not only Finland, but places like Canada, different provinces in Canada, the Netherlands, Estonia more recently, and some others. So let me show you a little bit what has happened. So we all probably here know that the OECD, that was also mentioned earlier, about 16 years ago, 17 years ago, came about with this new idea of collecting data from different countries and compare how these systems of education do across the OECD and beyond. Okay? So if this was 16 years ago, many of you here would know that later this year, 2001, OECD would for the first time make public the results of the first PISA study, PISA, not Pasi. Sometimes people introduce me as Pasi Sahlberg. I'm Pasi. Okay? And there would be in this room and in the coffee breaks a lot of speculation there. When you go and have your coffee, if this was 16 years ago, there would be a speculation about who will be the winners, who will do very well in this first OECD PISA study. And Finland would not be there on the list of anybody's speculations or expectations. You know, that time, because I was a university professor in Finland at that time, and we only had one expectation if we had anything regarding PISA. And that one expectation was that we wanted to be better than Sweden. We wanted to be better than our Western neighbor, Sweden. Otherwise, we didn't have any expectations. So when the first results came out, I'm sure that you cannot properly see this, but this was a huge surprise for many around the world, including us and my colleagues in Finland, because you see that there was a Finland, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Ireland, and South Korea that were leading this first OECD PISA study in 2000 or 2001 that we are looking at now. And you know, it was interesting in my country because we didn't celebrate and have fireworks and cocktail parties to say that finally we are the best in the world in education. Quite the opposite. Most people in my country were kind of doubtful. They say that maybe the OECD made a mistake measuring Finland. Because look at the other countries there, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, were doing much worse in this first study. So in my country we said that let's wait for 3 years and see what happens when the OECD comes with the same study next time. And maybe by then OECD has corrected this measurement error. And we would be like all the other Nordic countries. This is what happened 3 years later. And again you will see, and this is mathematics, Finland, South Korea, Netherlands, Japan, Canada, Belgium, so on. But still in my country we said that maybe the OECD made the same mistake twice. So let's not hurry. Let's wait what happens 3 years from now and see if this is really true. And we didn't have really any explanation, you know, why our 15-year-olds are doing that well in this increasingly important OECD measurement. And this is what we saw 3 years later. So this is a 2006 PISA study. Now we are looking at the December 2007, that is about 10 years from now in the history. And you will see that there's Finland, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, Netherlands. And you know, this is where we were in a point of time when many people around the world, in the United States, in the UK, and around the globe really, started to understand that something has changed. And it's not, I'm not only talking about my country, that's not important here. What is important here that when you look at those high-performing, well-performing education systems, they are not the ones that people just a few years earlier in this conference, remember, were expecting to do very well. And there were particularly interesting cases with countries like England or UK, Germany, France, that everybody, most people thought that will be doing very well because of the huge promises and investments in England for education reforms, or the high reputation system in Germany, or Sweden and Norway. Huge amounts of money had been spent to reform and develop the system to do well. And my point here is that two important questions evolved. So this is the end of the story of the OECD PISA, and this is pretty much the end of the story about Finland, because that's not my point here. My point here is that after this, starting from 2007, 2008, that time, the research community and policy-making community around the world, including here, started to ask these two questions that are extremely important for this conference and our work. The first one is, of course, that why so many of those countries that we thought will be doing well has not been able to get any better. Is there any way that we can explain the kind of a stagnant performance when we compare the educational performance to other countries? Or are these systems just too complex to understand? It's a very, very important question. So I was one of those researchers, and there were many around the world, particularly in the United States, Canada, England, Australia, Germany, Netherlands, who were looking at the same question. Is there any way that we can understand why these systems do not really improve? And these are some of those, I'll put you these things that we identified or have identified through research. So this is not my idea. This is not only how I think about these things. This is an outcome of the work of the many scholars around the world. And there are many things, but those 5 things are something that you find in many of those education systems that keep on struggling keep on improving and showing that they can do better in not only in learning outcomes, but also well-being and health and happiness of children, or equity, equality of the system. Probably the most common one is that there are still systems, and there have been many, who believe that competition between schools is the best way to move forward. It's the best way to drive improvement in education systems. In other words, introduce policies and incentives for schools to compete over children, enrollment, in other words, money. Then the other one is the idea of introducing more standardized testing and accountability systems. In other words, let schools to do more things autonomously, but then come up with the accountability and testing expectations. Many of those countries that have not been able to improve have done exactly this. They have been assuming, like America is a good example here, that the problem is a lack of accountability and data. And as soon as we fix that one, we will move forward, okay? Then we have the deep professionalization of education systems. There have been systems and continue to be education systems that basically open the teaching profession to anybody who is interested in working in a school or anybody who likes children. And there are many systems now that allow non-educators, non-professionals to lead the school, to be a school principal without any educational experience before. And then there's what I call addiction to reform. There are many education systems who believe that the problem is lack of reform, that we need to reform over and over again. I was advising one government recently where the Minister of Education had a habit to introduce new reform every Monday. Can you imagine? Every Monday when the minister comes to the office, he had a new idea what to do next. And of course, this is an indication of a very serious reform addiction, and has nothing to do with improving education systems. And then the idea of privatization. The conclusion that because public schools or public school systems are not able to perform, let's hand over these schools to somebody who can do it better. It's a very common thing, again in England, in the United States, in many Latin American countries and beyond. So this is what I have called often, and some others, GERM. Global Education Reform Movement, because many of these ideas that people believe are the best drivers or priorities for education policies are actually a kind of symptoms of a virus infection. And they should be treated as we treat infections, global infections in general, in medical world. So this is what it looks like. I had a little bit better, well, it should be the world map, and you see the germ infections there around the world, in England and North America, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, beyond. I have been in all of these places and always sat down with the minister and asked whether the germ infection symptoms have been visible in their systems, and if the answer is yes, you see the red dot over there. So the second question, also important, is that, so what's going on in those education systems that have been able to improve and do better? And you're going to hear about Singapore later here. Singapore is one of those amazing stories of, very rapidly turning around a system. But then there are many others. And these are those things that you will often identify. And we have done this through a massive amount of research globally, that we have identified as priorities, drivers in those education systems, where Finland is one of those, and Canada is a very good example, most of the Canadian provinces and territories over there. Collaboration, it's a teamwork, it's all about sharing, doing things together, helping schools to collaborate, helping teachers to work together, helping regions and districts to team up and help one another to do better. Not to compete against one another and so on. It's the same thing at the level of the children, learners, and teachers within the school. All of the school principals here, you are many here, you know that when you allow your teachers to work together, when you create a culture where your teachers understand that helping one another is better than competing against one another, I'm sure that most of you know that this is the way forward. Not to compete against one another. Trust-based responsibility. building trust in schools and teachers and children within the schools, and a kind of a sense of responsibility, not accountability, but primarily understanding that teachers and educators and school principals are responsible for what they do to children, parents, their communities, one another, not only to the authorities upstairs that the accountability often is all about. Teacher professionalism, insisting that only qualified experts, trained teachers and principals can work in a school seriously, not anybody. Just like we don't allow anybody to enter the medical clinic or dental clinic. Can you imagine going to see a dentist next time and you find somebody there who is not your trusted, experienced dentist? But there's somebody who says that, I am a civil engineer. I'm studying mining in a technical university. And I took this five-week training in the summer to do your teeth. So have a seat, and I'll take a drill. You wouldn't like that, no? And it's the same thing in our education system, that we would be mindful with that. System improvement, not the addiction to reform, but systematically, continuously improve the system. If it doesn't work, let's try to improve it. Unfortunately, in education, we don't behave like this. In education, if the reform doesn't work, we put it away and bring a new one, right? And education is the only field of human activity that I know behaves like this. In all other fields, you go to engineering, or innovation, or science, or health. If it doesn't work, we try to understand why it doesn't work. We try to improve it a little bit and try again, but not in education. That's our issue. And then equity. Equity or equality. I speak a little bit about equity before I close here, because that's particularly important thing, and I know that many people here understand equity in education in a very different way. Some of you think about equality. When you think about equity, you think about giving everybody the same curriculum, same access in school to different programs, same resources, same time of instruction, right? But equity is something different. Let me talk about this a little bit. So what we can do now with the data that we couldn't do 16 years ago is very interesting. Because we can ask the question that, okay, so if we are measuring equity of the system, equity of outcomes, I'm talking about the system level equity. And when we are measuring the learning outcomes, what children learn in reading, math, and science when they're 15 in this PISA study, is there any connection between these two? In other words, if the education system has more equity than average, does it mean that it also has more quality of outcomes? Or are these two variables, equity and quality, just independent? Very interesting question. I'm going to show you some data. So here you see the vertical axis is about quality. So when your country or when any country moves from bottom upwards, it means that the quality of outcomes improves. And when you move from left to right, as a nation or as a system, it means that you become more equitable. And equity here simply means that we are measuring how the family background, where children, kids, where they come from, how this is linked to their performance in school. In other words, how well they learn reading, math, and science. And everybody here should remember, always, two things. One is that when we are looking at these dependencies or correlations, correlation is not causation. That should be very clear. And secondly, that according to the research from last 50 years, we do know that most of the variation of students' learning outcomes in school can be explained by out-of-school factors. Not what's happening in a classroom or school, but something that happens at home or communities or with friends and peers, so on. So we need to remember those things. Okay, so if this is the average of these two variables internationally, we are looking at international, basically OECD, or as you heard, the club of the wealthier part of the world, education systems. So if your education system, if you find yourself here, it means that you are in a world of trouble. It means that you have trouble with quality of learning outcomes, and you have a trouble with equity of the system, right? If you are here, it means that you have less equity, but learning outcomes are better than average. Here are the education systems with a strong equity, but the issue challenge with quality of learning outcomes. And this, of course, is where anybody would like to be. If you speak to any education minister around the world or any education leader, and you ask, where would you like to see your system, local system or regional system or national system, everybody would say, I want to be there. I want to be where the equity is strong and quality is high. Are you with me? Yeah? Okay, you are with me? Wonderful. Okay. Now, let me take this away. And now you see a little bit, this is the same graph, bigger picture. But now we are looking at, based on the latest OECD data. And that's basically the only one we can use. If you don't like OECD data, you can close your eyes and ears for a moment. But there's nothing else we can do at this time, because that's the only one we have. Okay, so this is where Australia, I'm going to show you some of those countries. Unfortunately, I don't have Kazakhstan here because I'm only looking at the OECD education systems, just to make my point more clear. But you can think about Kazakhstan, your own system, where would you be? Okay? So this is where Australia is, this is United States, and this is UK. UK, if you break down UK to 4 jurisdictions, Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England, they are pretty much all there in this periphery. Okay? So now somebody concludes that, okay, if you speak English only in your country, you're average. Right? If you only speak English in your country, or one language, you're probably average. It may be true. If I was king of the world, and I was reading the World Bank report about the global crisis in education, one thing that I would probably do, not the only thing, but one thing I would do is to make sure that every child around the world would have a right to study a foreign language, whatever it is. Another language to learn, because that will help you to learn. That's what we know from research, that learning another language will help you to learn, as you will see when it comes to Canada. Do we have some Canadians here in the room? 1, 2. You should be very proud and very happy. I used to say always around the world that the world needs more Canada. Not only in the many other things, but when it comes to education, because you're doing extremely well. And my sisters and brothers in America, where I used to live for many years, don't really understand this. That what the Canadians are doing so differently that makes them a country that I often say that Canada is in heaven, educational heaven, because it's one of those education systems where quality and equity meet simultaneously. So if you don't like Finland, take a look at Canada. Canada is doing many of the similar things. And here are the others, and you will see that there's Japan, Finland, Canada, Estonia, they're in heaven. And South Korea is just about there. South Korea is so close to heaven that I often say that South Korea is knocking on heaven's door, if you remember the old Bob Dylan tune, right? But you know, this is what the world looks like when it comes to OECD education systems, and it's clear here that there's actually a very clear correlation there, not causation. We cannot say if one thing leads to another, but we can say that these two things, equity and quality, are connected. They take place often simultaneously. And this is a new understanding that we have when we think about education improvement. Very, very important. Okay? Look at Singapore and China. We probably hear more about Singapore's story here, but Singapore, I've been a lot in Singapore and read and studied and heard about it. And Singapore, one of the challenges that Singapore is facing is exactly making the education system fairer and more inclusive to all children, through access to early childhood education and many other things, to try to make sure that Singapore would be more equal, a more fair system. Okay? But those are those high-performing systems now: Estonia, Canada, Finland, and Japan. Okay? Are you still with me? Both Canadians are. All right. Now, take a look at this, and this is my conclusion here. And again, I'm speaking from the evidence. Remember, this is not my idea, this is not even my research. But I think this is much more important. 5 years ago, the OECD came up with a report that has been silenced. Not many people use it or even read it, but it's an OECD document called Quality and Equity in Education. And it's very important. It's OECD work, research based on the data that they have collected from the OECD countries. And take a look what the OECD, not me, or my colleagues, what the OECD concluded 5 years ago. Firstly, the OECD said that school choice advocates, in other words, those who are insisting more competition and choice at the level of the system, often argue that the introduction of market mechanisms allows equal access to high-quality schooling for all. This is OECD's conclusion. And they go on saying, however, evidence that they have, and other researchers have, does not support these perceptions, as choice and associated market mechanisms can enhance segregation. Go to Chile, go to America, go to Sweden, or Australia, where I spent a month just recently, and you will see what segregation in education does to the system. Not good thing at all. Very difficult to fix. And finally, this is what the OECD concludes, is that the highest performing education systems, Canada, Japan, Finland, Estonia, and some others, across the OECD countries are those that combine quality with equity. Very important. Okay? Take it or leave it. If you're a friend of evidence-based thinking and policy in education, take this seriously and read more, study more. If you're not, then you can think as you wish. Okay? So these are the three things that I would like to leave with you very quickly. Three things related to values, well-being, and innovation for the future. First, I think we all, if we are serious about education, improving education at the level of the school, district or oblast, or nation as Kazakhstan or Finland, we should enhance equity or quality of the system through equity. This is a good way to think, that we can make our education systems better by investing more and thinking harder about equity. Special education for children, kind of a whole child approach, more play for all the children, focus on health and happiness in schooling. Make sure that every child has a healthy meal and that they have healthy friends around them. It broke my heart outside when I was looking at some of those posters, is that Kazakhstan is number 2 in the list where nobody would like to be, and this is a list of rate of child suicides. So this alone is a call for more focus on equity. Then the second one is that invest in social capital. In other words, invest in teamwork, not only in human capital, not only in trying to improve teachers and principals individually, or schools individually. Social capital means that we try to do things together. We believe that by doing together, we will be better individuals. Research is very clear. OECD data is very clear with this, that social capital is actually more important in improvement than human capital. And for too long now, we have been thinking that the problem is lack of human capital in our schools and school systems. I think the problem is rather a lack of social capital and wrong type of policies that make us think that it's about lack of human capital. And then finally, if we are really serious about the future building education systems where all children would have access to good school, like a global monitoring report has a drastic data about hundreds of millions of children out of school and those who don't learn in a school because the quality is not there. The one thing we all can do is to think education as a public service, as a human right for everybody, not as a commodity, something that you can purchase and buy if you can afford that. So these are my three things. I think that this was it interesting to you? If it was, I thank you so much. I'm happy to have a conversation and talk with you later on. Thank you so much, people.